Fast, devastating, and bloodthirsty. This was the German army during the first years of World War II. It used lightning tactics where it accumulated its power in one place and attacked in a surprising way to break through the defenses of its enemies. In this way, it achieved great victories in short battles that did not take much time. However, one day Hitler encountered a battle so deadly that it completely twisted his plans, and the course of history changed forever. The Führer's ambition led a brave German battalion to Stalingrad, a strategic city, to continue with the expansion objectives. But there he encountered the brutal forces of the Soviet Union. The fight was so savage that it left 2 million dead. In this new military history video, we will go through one of the most important episodes of the Great War that broke out on the Eastern Front, and we will discover why it meant the beginning of the end for the Nazi regime. We warned you, you are about to come face to face with the enormous violence of the Battle of Stalingrad. To understand what happened during the memorable battle on Soviet soil, we must briefly review the relationship between the government of that country and Adolf Hitler. If we think of the fierce war that broke out between them, it is difficult to imagine that shortly before, they had signed an agreement to move forward with common plans. On August 23, 1939, the then Foreign Minister of Germany, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and that of the Soviet Union, Vyacheslav Molotov, drew up a very particular pact. Although part of the agreement was public, it also had some secret clauses within it. The points that were known by everyone spoke of a commitment to non-aggression between the signatories, and that if one of them was attacked by a third party, they agreed not to provide any kind of help to that country. Something important about this clause was that it was valid for 10 years and could be extended for 5 more in the future. However, what was hidden in the pact was that both nations had established a protocol to divide the territory of Poland. So days later, Germany launched its invasion without fear of Soviet intervention and unleashed the Second World War. The Germans were relentless in their deadly expansion across Europe. Their secret was their novel tactic called blitzkrieg, or lightning war. The Nazis sought to avoid prolonged battles, and instead aimed to defeat their opponents in a series of short campaigns. To do so, they concentrated their offensive weapons such as tanks, aircraft, and artillery on a small front. This grouped force was able to open a gap in rival defenses and penetrate enemy lines to create commotion and disorganization. In addition, Germany's air power was uncontrollable and did not allow its opponents to resupply or reorganize their troops. In this way, it not only achieved success in Poland, but from September 1939 to April 1941, it used this strategy to dominate Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, France, Yugoslavia, and Greece. The Nazi machinery fulfilled Adolf Hitler's every wish, but he would soon face a unique battle where an unstoppable power would come face to face with an indestructible force. The Führer's great obstacle was Operation Barbarossa. This was the Nazi leader's plan to betray his pact with the Soviet Union and invade that country. The mission began on June 22, 1941, when a new German conquest was put into action. The objective was to use slave labor from the occupied territories for the Axis war effort, while acquiring the oil reserves of the Caucasus and the agricultural resources of Ukraine. This was a key factor in being able to keep the troops of the Third Reich active and reaffirm the dominance of Lebensraum, the name given to the philosophy of colonizing lands and putting them under the control of German ideology so that the population could develop there. However, along the way, it was also hoped to achieve the extermination, enslavement, and mass deportation to Siberia of Slavic peoples in order to gain more land.
Al cabo de 24 horas, 1.500 aviones soviéticos son arrasados en tierra. Los alemanes derriban 300 aviones rusos más. Cogida por sorpresa y superada en número, la Fuerza Aérea Soviética ha sufrido un golpe devastador.
The Luftwaffe's attack was only the first step. Hitler had prepared a gigantic mobilization of more than 4 million men, a quarter of whom were Romanian, Finnish, Hungarian, Italian, and Slovak allies. This significant number of soldiers was grouped into 225 divisions, which were accompanied by almost 5,000 tanks, 50,000 artillery pieces, and 680,000 horses. In this way, it had become the largest land operation in history. Although the troops of the partner countries did not have the same fighting spirit as the Germans, the Führer believed that they would be useful for different tasks, such as maintaining the occupation in the secondary sectors of the Eastern Front. For 2 intense months, the Soviet Union deployed just over 3 million soldiers with 15,400 tanks, 63,000 artillery pieces, and 700,000 horses. With this, the Germans were able to sustain several confrontations, but the Nazis had still managed to advance in different areas. However, by December 1941, the scenario changed. The German invaders were feeling exhausted, and the scenario was completely altered. The Soviets, with their leader Joseph Stalin at the head, had mobilized the entire country to defend themselves and prevent Moscow from falling into Nazi hands. Furthermore, on a broader level, the Japanese Empire's attack on Pearl Harbor caused the United States to enter the war, and this was an important factor in another of the fronts that the Third Reich had open in the rest of Europe, since its occupation of France was at risk if the Americans joined that fight, as ended up happening in the Normandy landing. With all this, Operation Barbarossa came to an end. However, the ground gained by Hitler and his men was a prize that was not going to be wasted. And during the summer of 1942, the missions to reach the oil wells of the Caucasus were resumed. If this was achieved, not only would they be able to replenish their low fuel supply, but at the same time would also deny the Soviet Union the use of fuel. On the way to achieving this long-awaited plan of the Nazi leader, on August 23rd of that year, the deadliest battle of the Second World War broke out, and one of the most brutal of all time. When the German forces launched themselves with all their might to conquer Stalingrad, history changed forever. The dynamics of the war had changed in favor of the Allies. Victories by British forces in Africa and American troops in the Pacific began to compromise the Axis, which depended heavily on Germany. Therein lay the importance of a victory for the Nazis, who knew that a defeat could mean the final push their enemies needed to finally twist the fate of the conflict in their favor. The problem was that they were probably facing their greatest challenge, a city that knew what it was like to fight savagely. Located on the banks of the Volga River, it represented a vital port that during the Russian Civil War pitted the White and Red Army against each other for control. At that time, it was called Tsaritsyn, and in 1919 it fell into the hands of the Whites. However, strengthened by supplies from Moscow, the Red forces launched a fierce attack to recapture the city and managed to force their enemies to flee to Crimea, which played a key role in the final victory of the Bolsheviks. Years later, the city was renamed in honor of the high-ranking soldier who had been sent to secure that important victory, a certain Joseph Stalin. More than 2 decades had passed since that moment, but once again brutality would invade that place. While the Soviet leader was convinced that Hitler was regrouping his men for new attempts to conquer Moscow, the Führer sent the Wehrmacht, his armed forces, to the south. For this reason, while the Red Army was concentrated around the capital, the Germans had numerical superiority in their entry to Stalingrad. The invaders arrived from the north with incessant bombings until they reduced the city to rubble. Although the Nazi troops thought that this was the best way to take control, some historians claim that a place in ruins is actually much easier to defend than one where all the buildings are still standing. And that was the first obstacle for Germany. Dislodging the Soviets from their positions in a landscape of destruction became more complicated, and the locals took advantage of the situation.
Die feiern auf die eigenen Leute! Artillerie, Schweinepriester!
Despite the odds, the Wehrmacht took 90% of the city. But the Soviets held Stalingrad's industrial district in the north, while the Germans fought urban warfare. The Third Reich's troops had never fought in such a setting. They were accustomed to maneuvering in open terrain. As if that weren't enough, 2 other problems presented themselves for Hitler's men. As the wear and tear of the war took its toll on its ranks, the Red Army was able to supply its positions through tunnels and sewers that it knew all too well. And in turn, Stalin's forces bombarded their enemies' locations with artillery from across the Volga, thus preventing the Nazis from crossing with support. The place became a carnage that inflicted horrendous suffering on both soldiers and civilians. Living conditions were truly terrible. And although many citizens were evacuated as the battle continued or left for the surrounding rural areas, a large number of them became victims of the brutality of the fighting.
Da könnt ihr nichts machen, der ist kaputt.
It is true that the Germans had gained control of a good part of the burning town, but fear was more evident on that side. They knew that their opponent had the means to stand firm and endure a long battle. Aware of this, the Soviets learned to attack at just the right moments to slowly chip away at the Nazis' spirit. They did this at night, using the ruins as trenches from which a hidden wave of fire would suddenly fall upon the enemy. The ambushes served their purpose and had an effect that was rare in the Wehrmacht. This force was the pride of the Führer, full of brave men who were willing to fight to the death for the regime. However, Stalingrad became such a hostile and savage place that attitude began to falter. The Germans realized that they were invaders trapped in the cage of a ferocious communist lion, and that unbreakable courage finally cracked.
Ich will nicht raus! Raus aus dem Loch! Reiß dich am Riemen, du Arsch! Wenn das gehen in die Unwahrgebildung kommt! Und jetzt nicht mitgehst, dann bleibst halt hier, dann kann ich dir auch nicht mehr helfen! Meine Pflege kannst du im Dreck verrecken, dann bist du selber schuld! Scheiße, weiter, komm! Weiter! Los! Ich hab's dir doch gesagt, du Idiot! Mir nach!
Hitler knew that the advance his troops had made was a mere illusion. He was losing this war, but that did not stop him. He persisted in his attempt to take the city that bore Stalin's name as a huge symbolic prize. However, the Nazi leader's orders could not be translated to a force that was demoralized and disjointed in the countryside. The effective attacks of the Soviet Union caused the Wehrmacht to suffer from poor coordination between the different units and its supply lines that stretched to the breaking point. There were thousands of kilometers from Germany, and on that road, Stalin's fighters managed to prevent the arrival of any kind of help. As the months went by, the locals were increasingly better prepared to carry out a major counteroffensive, which finally occurred in November 1942. The Soviets used their advantage to put into action Operation Uranus. It was a classic pincer movement, trapping the Germans in the city they had destroyed, cornering them from the northwest and southeast. The Nazis could attempt their own attacks, but death always found them. On November 23rd, the two pincers of the Red Army met at Kalach, west of Stalingrad. German General Friedrich Paulus's Sixth Army was trapped, but Hitler refused to let the 300,000 exhausted soldiers retreat. The Nazis tried to supply their comrades by land routes from the south, and even by air to comply with the Führer's wishes. But nothing worked. These troops had fallen into their enemy's trap, and there was no way out. They found themselves in the middle of absolute hell. The Soviet strategy had been clever in exploiting their rivals' weak points, and the bravery of the German soldiers was reduced to a simple revelation. They were lost. In the midst of the harsh Russian winter, and with no attention paid to the shortage of supplies, the Germans were too weak to respond. Despite Hitler's specific request, the forces began to retreat. General Paulus was left alone and without hope. The great Nazi power was beginning to crumble. The Soviets had managed to prove that the Wehrmacht was not invincible. The Red Army had greatly improved and already greatly outnumbered its rival. The Führer had underestimated them, and now his troops were adrift, trying to escape through terrain where the advantage was increasingly clear for Stalin's men. The Germans who managed to survive and look for the way home found themselves facing a white and frozen border. There, death could come simply because of the conditions to which they were exposed. But the Soviet Union was not convinced to leave the fate of those enemies in the hands of the cold that froze the weakest. Better prepared for extreme terrain, Red Army forces advanced against their remaining opponents and exacted cruel revenge for the attempted conquest of Stalingrad. As the last German soldiers fell to the Red Army, General Paulus decided to finally disobey Adolf Hitler and agreed to surrender, along with 22 other senior Nazi commanders. On February 2, 1943, the last of the 91,000 starving and freezing men left from the invading forces surrendered to the Soviets. Only about 5,000 of that total later returned to their home country after the end of World War II. The rest perishing in brutal prisons and labor camps. After some 200 days of battle, Stalingrad fell silent, and it was time to count the casualties of the savage engagement. The Soviets recovered 250,000 German and Romanian bodies in and around the city. But that was only a small part, as total Axis losses are estimated to have been more than 800,000 killed, wounded, missing, or captured. However, the conflict also had a huge impact on Stalin's forces. Russian military historians estimate that 1.1 million Red Army personnel were killed, wounded, or missing in the campaign to defend the city. And as if that weren't enough, an estimated 40,000 civilians also died. Because of its length, the number of fallen combatants, and the relentlessness of the brutal attacks, the Battle of Stalingrad is regarded as a unique event in the entire Second World War. It was probably the most terrifying fight for both sides, who had to hold on to their weapons until the end, even when their instincts demanded that they flee as far as possible. Its significance is also often noted for the staggering destruction suffered by the city and how the lives of the survivors were drastically changed. In fact, for the communist government of the Soviet Union, it meant becoming a key player in the victory against Adolf Hitler's Third Reich, which allowed it to sit down with the Western Allies to establish agreements once the Nazi regime was defeated. In 1945, Stalingrad was officially proclaimed a heroic city for its defense of the homeland. In 1959, construction began on a huge memorial complex dedicated to the soldiers who achieved victory on Mamayev Hill, a high point that was crucial in the battle. The monument was completed in 1967 and is represented by a 52-meter-high statue of the motherland, a winged woman holding a sword aloft. Coming to the end, we can say that the combat in the town that bore the name of Joseph Stalin was as symbolic as Hitler had hoped, but with an opposite result. The defeated were the Nazis, and that was only the beginning of the debacle. The huge casualties suffered on the Eastern Front had a crucial impact on the Third Reich's struggle in the rest of Europe, and led to the advance of the Allies, who ended up winning the Great War. Now, after having seen the hell of Stalingrad, it is time to say goodbye. But first, we would like to know your opinion. Do you think that if Hitler had not ordered the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Nazis could have won the war? Leave us your answer below, and thank you for having accompanied us to the end. We look forward to seeing you in our next video.